Homophobia against straight men. This isn't a joke. This is deadly, deadly serious. Now, some of you immediately might think to yourself, this is ridiculous, or maybe kind of think it's kind of offensive, not least if you're an LGBTQ person who suffered bigotry, bullying, discrimination, violence of some description. I can speak to that myself. I was, without getting a tiny violin out, I was gay bashed by a far-right extremist on my birthday back in 2019, and far more gay and bi people have suffered far, far worse than I have. Now, I want to talk about this because it's International Men's Day and because it's a really, really important subject. Now, this is about understanding what homophobia actually is, but also it helps us understand how masculinity, if you like, the unwritten codes of what being a man is supposed to be about, how that is actually constructed. So homophobia, I think a lot of people would think, kind of boil it down to revulsion. It's same-sex, same-gender sexual acts. And that can obviously come into it, but I would say it's a side effect, not a cause. I mean, I do remember once I was in Germany and I saw this sticker, which I thought was quite profound, which said that homophobia is straight men fearful of other men treating them the way they treat women. And I think there is definitely something in that. But again, it links back to the point that I'm going to make, which is you should see homophobia as like the violent border guards of masculinity. It's there to enforce the rigid rules of what it is to be a man. So most straight men, I would say, I mean, I don't have the statistics to hand, but I'll come on to this. I would say most straight men have been on the receiving end of some form of homophobic abuse, maybe presented as light-hearted, but also often actually being very aggressive. And this happens when they deviate from the supposed rules or norms of what it is to be a man. And this can have catastrophic consequences, which I'll come on to. Now, maybe it's because they don't, if we think about, say, the playground, so talk about school, where homophobia is often, I mean, when I grew up in Stockport in the 1990s, it was like a constant background hum, I would say, homophobia. Maybe it's because, it's a guy who doesn't get into enough fights, seen as not aggressive enough, maybe not sporty enough, maybe he doesn't talk about other girls and women in sufficiently degrading terms, maybe too studious, maybe the way that he dresses or looks. And then he's likely to get something like, are you a puff or something? Or are you a bender? Or that looks pretty gay. Or, why are you being so gay? We could, goes on and on and on, often in terms which are more crude than others. Now, the 2010 Equality Act in Britain introduced what's called perceptive discrimination for a reason. So that is when people are treated unfairly, as it says, on the grounds they have a protected characteristic, whether they actually do or not. So if a straight person is identified or misidentified or treated as though, they're attacked, say, in the street and that attack is accompanied with homophobic abuse, that is a homophobic attack. It doesn't matter if they're gay or not. I mean, another example, which you get this staple response from apologists of Islamophobia, that hatred of Muslims doesn't qualify as racism because Muslims are not a race. They say this. Yet, if you witness the fact that many Sikh men on both sides of the Atlantic have been victims of Islamophobic hate crimes, so there'll be a Sikh man wearing a turban, and then an Islamophobic abuser will target them thinking they're a Muslim. That's an Islamophobic attack on a Sikh person. And that itself is a clue to what Islamophobia is, which is based on racializing minorities, race being obviously constructed. Now, similarly, many straight men are victims of homophobia because it is, as I've said, about policing the boundaries of masculinity rather than being repulsed towards gayness per se. So obviously queer men, LGBTQ men, are the biggest sufferers, obviously, of homophobic abuse, which I wouldn't want to belittle, and violence, precisely because we are seen to be the worst violators of masculine norms. What is deemed more unmanly than having sex with other men? That's why that's kind of the root of the revulsion, isn't it? It's about, a guy having sex with another guy has almost seem to have like repudiated or surrendered their masculinity as it's understood. That's why I think in Margaret Atwood's dystopian Handmaid's Tale, the term gender traitors is used to describe LGBTQ people who are obviously killed in this dystopia. I think that's so apt, because that's what that's how gay and bi people are. That's the basis of the persecution. It's interesting actually, when some people go, particularly transphobic people, why is the T thrown in with LGB? Because they're separate issues, which is LGB is about sexual orientation, who you're attracted to, whilst T is about gender identity. So why are they put together? Well, again, this explains it, doesn't it? Because the basis for the common oppression, the systemic oppression, if you like, of LGBTQ people is that we're all seen as having betrayed gender norms that are expected of us. That's the basis of it. Now, that's why I think, some people would say, well, I cannot believe you're making homophobia, kind of, oh, what about the straights? What about the straights? They're suffering. And that will rankle with lots of LGBTQ people. So I think a distinction needs to be made that homophobic bullying is an existential question for a queer person in a way it isn't for a straight person, because being abused for your actual identity, for a start, will inflict far more psychological harm. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have catastrophic consequences for straight men. So earlier this year, I wrote a column for The Guardian about this particular issue. And I did a shout out on social media for straight men who had been on the receiving end of homophobic bullying. I was shocked by the response. I was absolutely inundated. I had so many messages. It was unbelievable. So let's talk about Callum. So Callum, gay, bender and faggot, was spat at him by classmates with abandon, beaten up in the changing rooms before PE, and forced to change in the cleaner's cupboard instead. Not a gay guy, a straight guy. But it didn't matter to his assailants. Most of Callum's friends were girls, all treated as outcasts, some exploring their sexuality as teenagers. He hated sports and he loved performing arts. He was seen to have violated the norms of being a man, of masculinity, and therefore homophobia was deployed as a kind of punishment beating, if you like, or a means, of almost kind of those who are renegades of masculinity need to be punished, partly as an example to others. Now, Callum said to me, I feel really conflicted about it now. Even though I'm absolutely over the bullying, I always feel like I was a victim of homophobic bullying. But how can a straight cis man be a victim of bullying? And he fears invalidating the experiences of those who are actually gay whenever I talk about this. But there's nothing invalidating my story at all. Callum was the victim of sustained homophobic bullying. And lots of other straight men, more than talk about it, for the reasons partly Callum says, are also victims too. And, as I've said, this comes to, the point of what it is, what homophobia actually is. So, for example, other people spoke to me about the fact they had long hair, their dress sense, their job, being a primary school or a drama teacher. Extracurricular activities seem to be unmanly. So a former choir boy called Matthew said, I had the shit beaten out of me at least once a week for being gay or bent or whatever. If anything was considered outside the norm, it was considered gay when I was at secondary school in the noughties. He used to dress in a somewhat gothic way, eyeliner, black nail varnish, and was on the receiving end of homophobic insults quite a few times. And he said that even if you showed any form of affection towards another man, it was gay. Acts of kindness in the responses I got were cited as provoking homophobic responses, because apparently it's seen as unmanly to show kindness. Now, I think this is just really, really worth exploring, because actually the consequences for men, and this is why I'm talking about this on International Men's Day, are really actually quite catastrophic often. The biggest killer of men under 45 in Britain is suicide. And even though statistically women are more likely actually to suffer from, say, depression, they're actually more likely to get support. And the reason often men don't get support is they think that talking about their feelings is unmanly. And if you've been bludgeoned throughout your life using homophobic bullying to kind of bludgeon you into to anything that's seen to kind of be outside the masculine norms, you don't talk about your feelings because it's seen as a little bit gay. And that means lots of men, suicide is the most extreme example, but lots of men don't get the support they need and they suffer needlessly in silence. So huge numbers of men with depression aren't getting the support they need because it's seen as they can't talk about their feelings. And as I've said, this homophobic backdrop, this background hum, is one of the main reasons. So again, I think when we talk about homophobia, we understand it. We should understand it as the bastard child of misogyny. It's a means of conditioning men into embracing, glorifying traits that menace women and unmanly men alike. So, obviously, getting rid of his homophobia will liberate queer people, but it will also help straight people. It will help straight men as well. It will enable them to be themselves. It means a society with less violence and more love. And that's why, as I wrote in the article earlier this year, the homophobic persecution of straight men is not a tasteless distraction. To ignore it is to fail to understand homophobia at all. So happy International Men's Day, and let's fight homophobia, which, as I've said, is a byproduct of sexism and misogyny, because it will liberate queer people, but also all straight men. Please like, subscribe. I'll see you next time.